As you all know, Kathleen Kennedy has failed with a lot of recent Star Wars projects in recent years. And Kathleen Kennedy, well, she claims to be going ahead and want to retire on a win. And as you all know, Kathleen Kennedy has a new contract where she's going to be it's going to be about 2025 at Q2. So welcome back to Views with Hughes, your gender-free news. This is Jerome Hughes. Now, let's go ahead and get right into it. So right now, we're here to discuss, a big issue that has been over on the minds of Star Wars fans everywhere. The ongoing decline of the beloved franchise under the leadership of Kathleen Kennedy. Now, Kathleen Kennedy and her team have been at the helm of Lucasfilm for several years. And while some might argue that they've had their successes, the overwhelming reality is that Kathleen Kennedy and her decisions have led to a series of failures, particularly when it comes to connecting with the audience, a younger audience, or Gen Z. Well, let's talk about how Kathleen Kennedy and her belief that she can win over Gen Z by injecting woke political elements into Star Wars content. You see, Kathleen Kennedy and her team seem to think that this generation, which has grown up in a world of social media and instant gratification, is going to be swayed away by political messaging in movies and TV shows. But Kathleen Kennedy and her team need to understand that Gen Z is far more interested in short form videos from platforms like TikTok, where content is quick, snappy, and often devoid of, deep political meaning. Now, I also want to emphasize this point. You see, Kathleen Kennedy and her team's failure to grasp this simple fact is why Star Wars is failing to resonate with younger audiences. You see, Gen Z isn't sitting down to watch long, drawn-out movies or TV series. They're actually consuming content in bite-sized pieces, like 30 seconds, at least on average here, a minute there, and, they don't have the attention span or the interest to engage with the politically charged narratives in their entertainment. And yet Kathleen Kennedy and her team continue to go ahead and push this agenda, hoping that somehow it will capture their attention. But let me tell you, Kathleen Kennedy and her team is not working, But let's look at the numbers. You see, under Kathleen Kennedy and her leadership, we've seen a string of box office flops and underperforming TV shows. The Last Jedi, for instance, was a divisive film that alienated a significant portion of the fan base. And this wasn't just a vocal minority. This was a widespread backlash against a movie that Kathleen Kennedy and her team approved of, which is a movie that many felt betrayed the essence of Star Wars. And then there was Solo, a film that no one even asked for, and it bombed so hard at the box office that Lucasfilm had to rethink its entire strategy for standalone films. And Kathleen Kennedy and her team were at the center of this disaster. But let's not just forget the movies. It's not just the movies. Look at the recent Star Wars TV shows, aside from the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian, which were successful because, they returned to the roots of what made Star Wars great with a new storyline. We've seen a steady decline in quality and audience engagement after that. And Kathleen Kennedy and her team approved of The Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi, both of which failed to capture the magic of Star Wars, okay? Now, these shows were bogged down by unnecessary political messaging and a lack of cohesive storytelling, issues that can actually be traced directly back to Kathleen Kennedy and her leadership. And that's nothing new or surprising out there. But let's compare this to the other successes under Kathleen Kennedy and her tenure. In other words, much of the projects that she didn't really have much hand in. Rogue One was a hit because it felt like the classic Star Wars. It wasn't trying to push a political agenda. It was straightforward, gritty war film set in a Star Wars universe. Fans loved it because it respected the source material and delivered on what they wanted: action, adventure, and a story that fit within the established canon. Same goes for the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian, created by Jon Favreau. And these episodes brought back the feel of the original trilogy with new characters that felt like they belonged in the Star Wars universe. And there was no overt political messaging, just good storytelling. But everything else under Kathleen Kennedy and her team's watch, well, they've been a failure, to say the least. But on the other hand, Kathleen Kennedy and her team need to realize that Gen Z is not interested in the kind of entertainment that they're pushing out there right now. This generation is growing up with platforms like TikTok, where the most popular videos are often silly entertainment, and devoid of any deep political message, and they're not looking for long drawn out stories with complex themes. They just want something that they can watch quickly and move on from. And yet Kathleen Kennedy and her team continue to produce the different content out there that's out of touch with what this generation actually wants. And you know what? That's the minimal bad thing. And so what should Kathleen Kennedy and her team do? Well, it's clear that their current strategy is not working. But instead of trying to go ahead and pander to Gen Z with politically charged content, Kathleen Kennedy and her team need to go ahead and pivot and refocus on the generations that actually grew up with Star Wars, like Gen X and millennials. Now, these are the people who fell in love with the original trilogy, who remember the excitement of being the Empire Strikes Back in theaters, and who were thrilled when the Phantom Menace hit the big screen. And you know what? These are the people who still care about Star Wars, who still want to see it succeed, or at least some of them. But they're also being pushed away by the direction Kathleen Kennedy and her team have taken the franchise. Okay. Now, Kathleen Kennedy and her team need to get back to the basics. Strip out all the whole woke political elements that have plagued the recent Star Wars projects. Focus on, what made Star Wars great in the first place. With the epic space battles, the hero's journey, fight between good and evil, the timeless fight. That's the timeless fight right there. And Kathleen Kennedy and her team need to just go ahead and stop experimenting with social justice narratives that only serve to alienate the core fan base. It's time for the Kathleen Kennedy and her team to go ahead and start listening to the fans who have been with the Star Wars from the beginning, and stop trying to pander to the vocal minority. But let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Think back to the original trilogy. These movies alone didn't try to push a political agenda. They were straightforward stories about good versus evil, about hope in the face of despair. Okay, and that's it. That's plainly it. It wasn't a political figure. Skywalker wasn't a political figure. He was a hero, plain and simple. And that's what made those movies resonate with so many people. They weren't about preaching a message. They were about telling the story. But under Kathleen Kennedy and her team, we've seen a shift away from that kind of storytelling, and it's hurting the franchise. But let's also be honest here. Kathleen Kennedy and her team, look, listen, if you want to save Star Wars, you need to stop trying to chase after Gen Z with content they're not interested in. Instead, focus on the generations that still care about this franchise, like Gen X and millennials. Gen X and millennials are the ones who are going to introduce their kids to Star Wars. They're the ones who are going to buy the merchandise, the different video games, the Blu-rays. They're going to be the ones who will keep this franchise alive, but only if you give them a reason to. And is that plain and simple right there? I mean, let's face it, the merchandise is a mess. Now, under Kathleen Kennedy and her team, we've seen a decline in Star Wars toy sales. Why? Because the characters and stories that Kathleen Kennedy and her team have been pushing don't even resonate with the core fan base. Okay? Now, the toys based on characters from The Last Jedi and the Rise of Skywalker didn't sell because fans didn't care about those characters. You see, compare that to the toys from the original trilogy or even the prequel trilogy, which are still popular today. And Kathleen Kennedy and her team, this is a clear indication that your strategy is not working at all. Now, Kathleen Kennedy and her team, if you're watching, you have a chance to turn this around. You can still save Star Wars, but it requires a change of direction. You need to stop pandering to the generation that's not interested in your content and start focusing on the fans who have been with this franchise from the beginning. You also need to go ahead and get rid of the woke political elements and return to the classic Star Wars formula that made this franchise a cultural phenomenon in the first place. But who am I kidding? Kathleen Kennedy is not going to be able to do any of this kind of stuff, because the fact of the matter is this is what she wants and she's not willing to stop. So guess what? The only way that this can happen for Bob Iger and Disney is if Kathleen Kennedy's gone. So Kathleen Kennedy and her team, if you're listening, it's time to wake up and realize that your current strategy is failing with Gen Z, and Gen Z is not interested in your movies or your shows. They're on TikTok consuming content in 30-second bites, okay? And they're not interested in the whole political themes and narratives that you're pushing because, well, quite frankly, they don't have the time or the interest, okay? And Kathleen and her team need to realize it's time to stop chasing after a generation that's not interested and start focusing on the generations that still have a deep love for Star Wars, or those who are still a part of it. And you see, Kathleen Kennedy and her team, if they want to save Star Wars franchise and if Kathleen Kennedy wants to retire big, it's time to make a change to the drastic change. Gen Z is not your target audience. They don't care about your movies, and they certainly don't care about your woke politics. Kathleen Kennedy and her team need to understand it's time to return to the roots of Star Wars, to the classic storyteller that resonated with millions around the world. Focus on Generation X and millennials. Give them the Star Wars that we've been longing for. Okay, but only then Kathleen Kennedy and her team they're not willing to stand a chance at redeeming the Star Wars name and leaving behind a legacy worth remembering. But instead, that legacy has been tarnished. So thank you all for listening, and may the force be with you if Kathleen Kennedy and her team don't mess that up too. So let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. Also, be sure to include any additional thoughts you may have on this particular topic. If you enjoyed what I shared in this video, go ahead and smash the like button and share far wide across social media. And if you haven't done so already, and you enjoyed all the content that I put out there, go ahead, subscribe to the channel, click the bell notification so that way you'll be notified of future uploads and updates. Till then, peace.